So let's talk about Tecumseh Fitch. Dr. Fitch is an evolutionary biologist and cognitive scientist who received his PhD from Brown University and is now a professor in the Department of Cognitive Biology at the University of Vienna. He's published extensively on the evolution of speech, language, and music, and is the author of the 2010 book, The Evolution of Language. We were really excited to get a chance to talk with him, and we started off our discussion by talking about his recent research on how close to human speech these monkeys called macaques can get.
Yeah, well, so this was a project that was very long in the making because we needed to get these videos of monkeys doing basically all of the things that monkeys do with their vocal tract. So that it started with Asif Ghazenfar trying to train monkeys to vocalize on command, which turns out to be very difficult. So it's really challenging for monkeys to learn that. It's something that's easy for some species and hard for others, and for macaques it's not at all trivial. So in the end we had a combination of things that we could ask them to do, like making coos and threat vocalizations, and other things that we kind of tricked them into doing, like bringing another monkey into the room, or when their animal keeper left, they or giving them food, so that was we got them chewing and swallowing. So what we got in the end was a combination of lateral x-rays of vocalizations, various sort of facial displays like yawns, threats like this, lip smacks where they go, that's a kind of affiliative thing, and then eating grapes and bananas, etc. And so once we had these frames, we could then trace the vocal tract and use that as the input for our computer model.
Cool. So having done this study, so what are some of the implications of the research that you think?
Well, what we found is that previous estimates had greatly underestimated the potential of macaque vocal tracts. So that my PhD thesis supervisor, Phil Lieberman, had done this work long ago, back in the late 1960s, and found a very limited possible set of vowels. And what we found, the vowel space that we found is almost an order of magnitude, so it's about 7 to 8 times larger than those early estimates. Now, what Lieberman got right was that our monkey still didn't make certain vowels that humans make, like E and Oo, but the monkey could make a wide variety of other vowels, like I, a, aw. All of those are within the range of a monkey vocal tract. And what I think that shows is that at any point in our evolutionary history, whether in macaques or in chimpanzees or in Australopithecines or Homo erectus, the vocal capabilities were already there, that if there were a brain in control that can take advantage of those latent capabilities, that we would have been able to produce quite intelligible speech.
Oh.
And Phil Lieberman agrees with that. I think the myth that it's the vocal periphery that keeps animals from speaking is a very widespread one, but we are hopeful that this study will finally lay that myth to rest.
Cool. Yeah. So have people been taking this new revelation about sort of the vocal tract in these mountains? Like how has it been received?
Quite well. I mean, a lot of people, including ourselves, didn't find it that surprising. So one of the funniest headlines that I saw was I think it was the Scottish Sun saying, monkeys can't speak because they're too stupid. Which, that's not really about stupidity. It's actually about much more specific ideas about what the neural mechanisms that control the vocal tract are. But, so on the one hand, it's not that surprising. But as I said, it's this very widespread myth. I mean, you see it things like The Simpsons or in all the textbooks. You find it in David Crystal's Encyclopedia of Language.
Right.
So it's a very widespread idea, and I hope we can finally lay that to rest. And there haven't been any major criticisms.
Cool. Great. So I wanted to ask a question that both we had and that we saw Mark Lieberman also had on Language Log, which is we can see we have much more space for the macaques in the vocal tract than we had realized previously. But when you listen to sort of the sounds that are made by them, they still don't sound like human-like speech, right? Like they're still distinctly non-human. So we were wondering whether, once we got to the point where our brains could handle language and we had a vocal tract that was sort of like a good portion of the way there, was there more evolution in the vocal tract? Sort of more specialization, do you think?
Well, the critical thing, first of all, is to realize that the potential is there, but it's clear that they don't use that potential in their communication system.
Right.
So, they could easily make 4 different calls that were the it call, the a call, the call, and they don't. So we're not claiming that monkeys use that potential. We're just claiming that it's there in the peripheral anatomy. Now, I think once we had speech, there almost certainly was additional evolution of the vocal tract. So we know that we have these descended larynges, and we've swallowed the back half of our tongue. That's something that's not present in chimpanzees and other apes. So whether that got stronger, that descent of the larynx became more extreme due to the pressures of speech or something else initially, I think is an interesting question, because we do know that other animals like lions and deer or koalas have a descended larynx, and they clearly don't use it for speech. In that case, it seems to have been selected to basically exaggerate size. So one thing I think is possible is that the larynx descended for reasons having to do with size exaggeration, but was only later, this larger vocal tract space was only later co-opted for speech. I think that's quite possible. But the fact that the larynx descends in babies, starting at about age 3 months, I think is clear evidence that today in modern humans, the descent of the larynx is playing a role in speech.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
But it doesn't, it's not like you can't speak without a descended larynx.
Right.
That's the key point.
Stepping back from his current research, we asked him about a paper that he wrote about Charles Darwin's thoughts on the evolution of language, and his thoughts about Darwin's hypotheses about where our language came from.
Yeah, Darwin was quite worried about music because he knew that all human cultures have music, and it seemed to him that there was no good selective reason, there was no adaptive reason that you would have music. It seemed like kind of a waste of time, unlike language, which clearly serves various adaptive communicative functions. And his solution to that problem, it was one of those things that kept him up at night, like the peacock's tail. And his solution to that problem was that, in fact, music was the sort of language, the predecessor in some pre-modern ancestors of humans, that we evolved the capacity for song and for, basically for song, something like music, early on. And that was in a context of vocal learning, like in birds, and in a context of sexual selection. And that sort of musical proto-language formed the beginning stages. That got our vocal control and our neural circuits for controlling our vocalizations going. And then that only later was put to use in linguistic communication, so in fully syntactic and semantic linguistic communication. So that's the musical language, musical proto-language hypothesis.
Right. How do you feel about this? Do you find this hypothesis convincing?
Well, it's a hypothesis, so it's. I think it's a plausible hypothesis. That's the best we can do with hypotheses, is make sure they're consistent with all the facts, and then we can try and test them. I think the data that we have in terms of the antiquity of music is consistent with that, though it's not much data. I think the fact that the evolution of vocal control has occurred multiple times in multiple other species independently of us in a musical context, like birdsong and whale song and seal song, etc., I think is consistent with that. So I think it's plausible enough to take seriously. That doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
We wanted to follow up with a question about how we build our theories. After all, language may be great for a lot of things, but it doesn't leave fossils. So how do we avoid just picking whatever story we like best? How can we tell what's likely to be correct?
Well, I think there's 2 crucial sources of data that enable us to test otherwise speculative hypotheses about the function, evolutionary function. One is the comparative method, and I think that's the most valuable, because when we have something that's, say, present in one clade and not present in another, and particularly when we have convergent evolution where that same ability, like bipedalism or vocal learning or trichromatic color vision, etc., when we have multiple instances where that's evolved in parallel, where we have a pair, 2 clades where one has evolved it and the other one lacks it, that gives us an ideal opportunity to start asking questions. Under what circumstances does this evolve? What are the mechanisms that you need to have this ability? So I think when the data are like that, that's the best way to go.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we don't always have things like that. So for example, we're unique in the animal kingdom in having language. If only we had 8 other species that have independently evolved language, we would be much further ahead. So I think in cases where there really is a truly unique human autapomorphy, so a derived character that's unique to us, The best tool we have right now is paleo-DNA.
Okay.
So by being able to recover the DNA from Denisovans and Neanderthals, and now even Homo antecessor, probably we'll be able to go back even a little bit further than that. To the extent that we understand what those genes do, we already can ask, what did Neanderthals have? Now, the problem, of course, is we still don't have that good an understanding of genes, and certainly not genes that are for language, genes that are involved in language. But in the best case, the best data we have is for FOXP2, which is not a gene for language. It's a gene for enhanced vocal control, and particularly enhanced sequence learning of the vocal apparatus. The human allele of that, I should say, plays a role in that. FOXP2 plays a role in all kinds of things. And in that particular case, we know that Neanderthals had the derived allele. So they shared the derived allele that we don't share with chimpanzees. So already they had got some aspect of this enhanced vocal control. Now it turns out there's an enhancer region that's different in us and them. So they didn't have exactly what we have. But I think that really strongly points to the idea that vocal control was something that came early, in that Neanderthals and Denisovans already had it, even though, based on the cultural record, they probably didn't have fully modern human language. Whether they were lacking syntax or semantics or exactly what was missing, we don't know, but they didn't have the same kind of symbolic cultural explosion that we see in our own lineage.
Right.
So I think that's one example. It's the best gene we've got. That's an example that vocal control, as Darwin hypothesized, came earlier than full modern human language. But to really put that approach to work, we need more genes that we can say specifically, this is involved in complex semantics, this is involved in hierarchical embedding, blah, blah, blah. And we don't have that right now.
Right.
But the good news is that that's just normal genetics. That's what clinical geneticists are trying to do. And that game is not pure speculation.
Right.
It's not based on finding new fossils. It's based on looking at living organisms today.
Right, because FOXP2 is often associated with specific language impairment and things like that. So if we can find cases otherwise where...
Yeah, well, there's a big set, Robo and Slit and Catnap2. There's a whole set of genes that are coming in. Probably none of them will be quite as clean in terms of the phenotype as FOXP2. That much already seems clear. We got pretty lucky by getting FOXP2 first.
Right.
And it's not a gene for language.
Yeah.
It's really a gene about speech.
Right.
But I think that's the sort of best opportunity we have to really test some of these hypotheses that have been around for a long time. Whether Darwin's musical proto-language hypothesis or the gestural proto-language hypothesis or lexical proto-language, all of these are in principle testable with this paleo-DNA.
Going back to Dr. Fitch's research suggesting that it's intelligence and not anatomy that leads us to be able to use language, that sounds a lot like the plot of the current Planet of the Apes movies, where an experiment gives one of the apes enough intelligence to allow him to speak. But presumably, that's not how we ended up with language. Dr. Finch had argued in the past that recursion, or the ability to nest things inside the same type of thing, was the #1 factor. So we asked him whether he still believed that.
Well, okay, that's a big question, because I think we need to separate what makes us unique as humans from all other species versus what makes us different from our nearest living relatives, chimpanzees, and therefore by inference had to evolve since our split from chimpanzees.
Right.
So there are things like, for example, displacement, so talking about things that aren't present, that is quite unusual about human language, but we share it with honeybees.
Right.
So, but that's clearly a convergently evolved trait. So I think the question of what makes us special, a better question is, what needed to evolve from our common ancestor with chimpanzees? So what can we infer wasn't there in that common ancestor by looking at chimpanzees and other apes, and that we clearly, and from that point of view, there's at least 3 different things that clearly differentiate us. One is this capacity for vocal control that we've already been talking about. So the capacity for complex vocal learning, for learning new sounds, for hearing a new word and then being able to produce that. It's clearly something that neither chimpanzees nor other apes have. It's something that we clearly do have. So that's one thing. But that really is about the output mechanism. And we know that, for example, we can communicate perfectly linguistically using sign. So I wouldn't put that at the center. I would say that's something that had to evolve, but it's not really at the heart of what makes language language.
Right.
And of course, there are many other species that have vocal learning. That's why parrots and seals and other species can learn to say English words or any language. So yeah, there's and written language is another example where you can use a different output modality.
Right.
So I think the two things that are more central are some aspect of syntax, probably maybe several aspects of syntax, and I'll come back to that. But also in semantics, complex theory of mind. So having some model of what you know and what you don't know, so that I can tell you things you don't know, and doing that cooperatively. What I've called Mitteilungsbedürfnis, the desire to share information. That's very strong in humans. Again, I don't think it's unique to humans because I think 2 honeybees have a Mitteilungsbedürfnis. They have this drive to share information. But again, it's not something that's typical of chimpanzees.
Right.
So I think that's a suite of things that surround semantics and pragmatics that also had to change. Ostensive signaling, so the very notion that we can signalhood. We can signal that I'm trying to tell you something right now. So that's a suite of things that I would put in the semantic pragmatic category. But now coming back to the central question of syntax. So in our 2002 paper, Mark Hauser, Noam Chomsky, and I suggested that of all these things that are shared, not necessarily with chimpanzees, but with some species, the one thing that really seems to be, that stands out in human language as special, not just with other animals, but also as a domain of human cognition, is recursion. That was a hypothesis. It's a testable hypothesis. We called the set of things that are both unique to humans among other animals, but also unique to language in the domain of human cognition. We dubbed that the FLN, the faculty of language in the narrow sense. And we offered the hypothesis that might be an empty set. That might be empty. There may be nothing like that. I think subsequent research in mine and other labs suggests that recursion is not limited to language. So we have clear evidence now, both in the visual domain and in music, that humans can process recursive structures. So I don't think it's unique to language. On the other hand, it might still be something that's unique to human cognition and that we don't find in other species. There, I think the jury's still out. There are claims of finding recursion based on showing that animals can master a super regular grammar, A to the N, B to the N. I think those are completely wrong. I mean, that's just a misinterpretation of the whole thing. There are also empirical problems with it. That's an interesting question in itself. There are empirical problems with that. But the way I currently am thinking about the sort of specialness of syntax is that it really is about hierarchical embedding. It's about being able to build up larger and larger units without any non-arbitrary bound on those. And without that, and also rules that operate over trees, which is very familiar to linguists, but not necessarily familiar to everyone else. So this idea that the key thing is not a word in a sequence, but rather a group of words that form a larger group. I actually see that as being at the heart, not just of language, but also of music, and I think probably lots of other aspects of human cognition. So I call that sort of not just the ability to build trees and to recognize trees, but also the proclivity to see everything in tree terms. I've dubbed that dendrophilia, the love of trees.
That's a good term.
And that's what I see as really being at the heart of human cognition. And as I said, it's not unique to language. So I would say my thinking about that has changed. What's the difference between hierarchy and recursion? Well, recursion is a special case of hierarchy. Recursion, you have the same thing embedded within itself multiple times, whereas hierarchy is more open. You could have different things embedded within different things, but the key idea is that you have multiple layers of a tree.
Right. No, that's really cool.
And all of our evidence suggests that either animals don't have that, or it's really hard for them. So it's really not something that comes naturally. Oh. And for humans, we almost can't help ourselves.
Yeah.
We are dendrophiles.
Yeah. No, I really like that. That's a very interesting idea. Do you have any opinion or like a hypothesis at this point where that came in from? Was it more through music? Was it more through some other realm of cognition and recruited for language? Or?
No, I don't have a strong opinion about that. I think there are multiple plausible pre-adaptive domains where you can see some hierarchy. I guess if I had to put my money on it, I would say motor control and motor planning, maybe the most plausible one, because you certainly see complex motor control, hierarchically structured motor control in lots of animals, but particularly in chimpanzees who are technologically quite sophisticated. So I would think, but quite encapsulated. So it's really motor planning. It's not. So I would think that that would form something that, if generalized across other domains into audition, into vision, could be a very plausible starting point. But another possibility, and I think Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney have made a very elegant argument that the social cognitive domain, this is a place where primates are quite unusual, seeing individuals as belonging in groups and seeing both individuals and groups in as working together and as obeying certain rules. So that kind of social cognition is another plausible starting point. Also navigation, knowing that a location can be within a larger location, can be within a larger location. So I think all of those are plausible, and right now we don't really have any evidence that strongly points in one direction or another. And obviously the whole point of dendrophilia is we apply it across the board. So its generality is ultimately what makes it so powerful, I think.
Dendrophilia is a really awesome word that I'd like to be able to use more often. Anyway, we also asked about what role he views social media and YouTube as playing in science communication and education.
I can say I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I should do it more often.
Yeah.
I released a few blogs for National Voice Day. I did a few sort of 5-minute introduction to bioacoustics things, and there's a bunch of my lectures. But to be honest, I don't do it that often. But I think it is a good thing because you reach millions of people. My own, I've watched a few TED Talks, but it's not something I do a lot of. I've actually watched a lot of whole lectures, so the MIT source, but now they're all over the place. So I've learned a lot by watching just video recorded lectures. That's great. But my own use of YouTube is pretty, I would say 90% music. Okay. So I find new songs. I like to go back and see Wes Montgomery and whatever. There's so much great old stuff now, so you can see everybody playing the music. So that for me, that's more of a hobby thing than a work thing.
It's good for both.
So that's it. Our sincere thanks to Dr. Fitch for sitting down with us to discuss his work. We put links down in the description to some of his papers. And thanks to you for watching. We'll be back next time with a regular episode. See you then.